France is known as the country of art, romance, and elegance. But hidden across its countryside, buried inside its cities, and locked behind rusted iron gates, are schools that France would rather you forgot. Schools where something so disturbing happened, so terrifying, so tragic that no one ever went back. And the reasons, some of them will genuinely shake you. Before we start, if you're new here and you love uncovering the hidden, dark, and forgotten side of history, this channel is exactly for you. Hit subscribe right now, because what you're about to see is only the beginning. France has over 50,000 school buildings across its territories. Most of them are completely ordinary: chalk dust, lunch breaks, children laughing. But some of them are sitting completely empty right now, frozen in time, doors sealed, desks still in place, chalkboards still written on. And when you find out why they were abandoned, you'll understand why nobody went back. We're talking about a school where a nuclear-level explosion shattered every window in the city. A school where children were subjected to horrors for decades, while the government looked the other way. A village school whose students never made it home, not because of illness, not because of poverty, but because of one single afternoon in 1944 that wiped out an entire community. Today, we're counting down 12 schools in France that were abandoned for deeply disturbing reasons. Some of these you will have heard of, most of them you haven't. Let's go. Number 12, the Pensionnat Catholique de Fénétrange, Moselle, northeastern France. We start in a village near the German border. Here, nestled in a quiet town called Fénétrange, stands a massive, cathedral-like boarding school that once held over 600 students. Built in 1937 for girls under the care of the Sisters of Divine Providence, this school had a turbulent existence from the very beginning. When World War II broke out, German forces occupied the building entirely. They evicted the nuns, evicted the students, and turned it into a military installation. Think about that. Children's dormitories, a chapel built for prayer, turned into a German military base overnight. After the war, the Allied forces reclaimed it. The school reopened, expanded, and at its peak in the 1970s, it housed more than 600 students in its vast corridors and dormitories. But the numbers slowly dwindled, interest declined, students moved on to more modern institutions. By 2001, it closed its doors for good. Today, urban explorers who have made it inside describe the place as frozen in time: crumbling classrooms, a grand chapel still eerily intact, gymnasiums covered in decades of dust, and school reports scattered across floors as if the students simply vanished one afternoon and never came back. The building still stands, still silent, still waiting. And if you think that's unsettling, the next school on our list was abandoned because of something far more deliberately evil. Number 11, the abandoned mountain school of the Languedoc. Deep in the rugged mountains of the Languedoc-Roussillon region in southern France, urban explorers discovered a small, completely isolated school that appeared to have been frozen in a single moment. Inside, old school bags, exercise books with children's handwriting still clearly visible on the pages, geography homework, tables and chairs still arranged in rows, books still on shelves, report cards with names. The building itself is structurally dangerous, on the verge of collapse, and has been empty for nearly 2 decades. No widely published official explanation was ever given for why this mountain school was abandoned. The most likely reason? Rural depopulation. A quiet crisis sweeping across France's interior as young families leave for cities in search of work and opportunity, leaving entire villages and their schools completely empty behind them. But the eerie part isn't the abandonment. It's the preservation, everything left behind, as if the teacher stepped out for a moment and simply never came back. Now, the next 3 schools on this list weren't just abandoned, They became symbols of institutional failure on a national scale. Number 10. L'École Anglaise, Auvergne, Central France. In June 2017, police and gendarmes descended on a small traditionalist Catholic school called L'École Anglaise in the Auvergne region of central France. What they found shocked the country. The school's director was detained. Out of 109 enrolled children, roughly 60 were immediately interviewed by investigators. The allegations: systematic physical abuse, corporal punishment, suspicions of offenses of a sexual nature, illegal labor, financial fraud. The school was shut down on the spot. Children who had been living there as boarders were removed from the premises that same day. What made this case particularly disturbing was the school's extreme isolation, both geographically and ideologically. A traditionalist institution with minimal outside oversight, operating in a tight-knit religious community where children had nowhere to turn and no one to report to. After the raids, the school never reopened. The building remains closed. The children moved on, but the questions about how this had been allowed to continue for so long, those remain unanswered. And that case was shocking, but wait until you hear about number 9, a school that became the center of something even larger. Something that has shaken the entire French government to this very day. Number 9. Notre Dame de Bethlehem, l'Estelle Bethlehem, the Pyrenees. This is the one that changed everything. Nestled near the famous pilgrimage site of Lourdes in the French Pyrenees, Notre Dame de Bethlehem was considered an elite Catholic boarding school. Prestigious, well-connected, the kind of school that wealthy and ambitious French families sent their children to. But behind those walls, over several decades spanning from 1957 all the way to 2004, something horrifying was happening to students. A French parliamentary inquiry, the most comprehensive investigation into a single school in French history, has described what took place there as the country's largest school abuse scandal ever recorded. More than 200 legal complaints have been filed. Over 90 of those are for sexual violence or rape, and the abuse investigators found was not isolated, it was systematic. Physical punishment so extreme it became ritual, humiliation, sexual violence by priests and staff across multiple generations of students. One survivor described the school as the Gulag of the Pyrenees. Among the most chilling accounts, there was a man who would reportedly turn his signet ring inward before delivering blows, a gesture so consistent that students knew what was coming the moment they saw it. Older students also knew to watch for other signs of what was about to happen. And the most disturbing part of all, complaints were reportedly filed as early as the 1990s. Nothing happened, nobody came, the abuse continued. The scandal became politically explosive when it emerged that France's current Prime Minister, François Bayrou, was education minister during part of the abuse period, and that his children attended the school while his wife taught catechism there. Bayrou has denied any knowledge of the abuse and has testified under oath before a parliamentary commission. A parliamentary report adopted in June 2025 called it a damning indictment of the French state's inaction. The school closed and was renamed in 2009, but justice for most victims blocked by the statute of limitations will never come. Now, we've talked about institutional abuse. But the next few schools on this list were abandoned for reasons that were entirely outside human control. Disasters so violent, so sudden, they left entire buildings uninhabitable overnight. Number 8. The Schools of the Southern Quarter, Toulouse, France. It is September 21, 2001. It is a Friday morning. Children across Toulouse are sitting in classrooms. Teachers are mid-lesson. The day is completely ordinary. And then, the explosion was so powerful it registered as a 3.4 magnitude earthquake on seismic monitors. It was heard by residents 80 kilometers away. Steel girders were found 3 kilometers from the blast site. The crater left behind was 7 meters deep and 40 meters wide. The AZF chemical factory, storing 300 tons of ammonium nitrate, had just detonated in what became the second largest non-nuclear explosion in recorded history. In the schools closest to the blast zone, walls collapsed instantly. Windows didn't just shatter, they were vaporized. A student at a professional college located just 500 meters from the epicenter was killed when a concrete structure collapsed on top of her. 100 schools across Toulouse were damaged. 5 of them were entirely destroyed. 31 people died, over 2,500 were injured. Thousands more sought psychological treatment in the weeks that followed. A witness who was 13 years old at the time and sitting in a history class when it happened recalled the doors and windows of her school blasting open without warning. Nobody knew what had happened. Nobody knew if the cloud rising over the city was toxic. Children were sent home in a daze while parents rushed through streets covered in dust and debris. For the schools directly in the blast radius, there was no coming back. The structural damage was absolute. Those buildings were demolished. What had been places of learning became, in a single Friday morning, monuments to industrial negligence. And speaking of toxic devastation, number 7 involves a school catastrophe in Paris that was hidden from the public. A cover-up that authorities tried desperately to keep quiet. Number 7, the schools closed near Notre Dame Cathedral, Paris, 6th arrondissement. On April 15, 2019, the world watched in horror as Notre Dame Cathedral burned. Most people remember it as a cultural tragedy. What fewer people remember is what happened in the weeks and months that followed and the children who paid the price for what came next. Notre Dame's roof contained approximately 300 tons of lead. When the fire burned at over 800 degrees Celsius, that lead didn't just melt, it vaporized. A toxic plume of lead dust drifted across central Paris, settling on streets, on playgrounds, and on school courtyards. Initial official statements insisted there was no danger to the public. Then, the French investigative website Mediapart obtained confidential documents. Lead levels in schools surrounding the cathedral were 500 to 800 times the official safe limit. 500 to 800 times. Paris authorities shut down 2 schools immediately as a precautionary measure. Further testing led to the closure of additional schools in the weeks that followed. By September 2019, a 6th school had been closed. Approximately 260 children had already been playing in those contaminated schoolyards before any action was taken. Blood tests were administered. Parents were furious, not just about the contamination, but about the deliberate downplaying of the risk by city officials who seemed more focused on protecting the reputation of the restoration project than on protecting the children underneath the fallout. Lead poisoning in children is not reversible. There is no cure, there is no undoing it. Some of those schools remained closed for extended periods of time while full decontamination was carried out. And some questions about the long-term health effects on those children have never been fully and publicly answered. From a fire that contaminated a city, we now go to number 6, a school that was never rebuilt. In a village that France made a deliberate decision to freeze in time forever. Number 6, the school at Oradour-sur-Glane, Haute-Vienne, France. There are abandoned schools, and then there is this. June 10, 1944, 4 days after D-Day. The village of Oradour-sur-Glane was going about its ordinary Tuesday. Students were in school, farmers were working in the fields, women were shopping in the market. At midday, soldiers of the 2nd SS Panzer Division des Reich surrounded the village and ordered every man, woman, and child to gather in the central square. A routine identity check, they said. It was not a routine identity check. 642 civilians were massacred that afternoon. The men were herded into barns and shot. The women and children, including every child from the village school, were locked inside the church and burned alive. The school itself, along with the entire village, was then set on fire and burned to the ground. Only 7 people survived. After liberation, French President Charles de Gaulle made a decision. Oradour-sur-Glane would not be rebuilt. The ruins would remain exactly as the SS left them. A permanent memorial, an eternal indictment of what had been done there. Today you can visit, you can walk past the shell of that school building. You can see where the desks once stood, where the chalkboard once hung, where the teacher once called the register on an ordinary Tuesday morning. And you can read the names on the memorial nearby and understand that the reason this school was abandoned is not negligence, not contamination, and not abuse. It is grief. It is an entire country saying, "We will not pretend this did not happen." We've reached the halfway point, and the stories only get stranger from here. Coming up, a school closed because of what was found buried underneath it. And one that the entire country voted to walk away from, with the toxic truth hidden inside its very walls. Stay with me. Number 5. The schools of contaminated Normandy, northern France. Normandy carries the weight of war in its soil, quite literally. Across northern France, construction projects and school expansions have been halted for decades when workers unexpectedly hit buried remnants of both world wars, unexploded ordnance, chemical munitions, and in some cases, the remains of those who never made it home. Several schools in the Normandy region have been temporarily or permanently closed when ground surveys revealed unexploded shells or toxic chemical weapons residue directly beneath school foundations. In at least one documented case, ground contamination from decades-old military disposal sites was severe enough that the school building was condemned and the entire institution relocated. The original site remains fenced off, too dangerous to demolish, too toxic to ever build on again. France has an estimated 12 million unexploded ordnance items still buried in its soil from the First and Second World Wars. Many of them sit directly beneath populated areas, beneath roads, beneath homes, beneath schools. The earth itself in some parts of France is still at war, and the buildings that sit above that earth have paid the price. And from something buried underground, we now go to something that collapsed from the inside. Number 4 is the story of a crisis so widespread, so quietly devastating that it has swallowed hundreds of schools across France without a single headline. Number 4, the schools of rural depopulation, multiple communes across France. This one is different because the disturbing reason here isn't violence, it isn't contamination, it isn't disaster. It's something quieter, and in many ways more haunting than any of those things. France has been facing an accelerating crisis of rural depopulation for decades. Entire villages are emptying out as young families move to cities in search of work, education, and opportunity. And when a village loses its children, the first thing that closes is always the school. Across regions like the Creuse, the Cantal, and the Ariège, hundreds of schoolhouses now stand completely empty. Some of them closed in the 1980s, some closed last decade, some closed in the past few years. Urban explorers who have entered these buildings describe them as deeply unsettling, not because of what happened there, but because of what didn't happen. Schools full of textbooks that no child will ever open again. Children's drawings still pinned to corkboards, timetables still written on blackboards as if Monday morning is still on its way. The last day of class suspended forever. France's rural school closure crisis has now reached a point where the government has had to create emergency policies to merge institutions across entire regions, sometimes over fierce community protest, sometimes in communities that have already lost everything else. These buildings don't get decontaminated, they don't get demolished, they're just left. And slowly, quietly, nature takes them back. Coming up, number 3 involves a French school where the government made a shocking admission about what had been hidden inside the walls for decades. And number 2 is a story of a crime so disturbing that it changed French law. You will not want to miss either of these. Number 3, the asbestos schools of France, multiple locations across the country. Asbestos. Between the 1950s and the 1970s, France, like much of the industrialized world, used asbestos extensively in school construction. It was cheap, it was fireproof, it was considered completely safe. It was not safe. France officially banned asbestos only in 1997, one of the later major industrialized nations in Europe to do so. By then, asbestos had been installed in the walls, ceilings, floors, and heating systems of thousands of French school buildings across the country. When mandatory testing programs finally rolled out, the results were staggering. Hundreds of schools were found to have hazardous levels of asbestos contamination. Some were cleaned and kept open. Others were condemned outright and closed permanently. Teachers and school staff who had spent entire careers working inside these buildings, breathing in microscopic fibers every single day without knowing, began developing mesothelioma, a fatal form of lung cancer with no cure, caused directly by asbestos exposure. Several French school unions filed landmark lawsuits against the state, arguing that successive governments had known about the risks and had deliberately minimized them to avoid the cost of removal and remediation. Some of those condemned school buildings, still structurally sound, still full of desks and chairs and equipment, cannot be entered without full hazmat protection. They sit behind chain-link fences, empty, the asbestos still inside their walls because the cost of demolishing them safely is more than anyone has been willing to pay. 2 more to go, and I've saved the most chilling for last. Number 2 will make your jaw drop. And number 1 is the school that France has deliberately refused to repair, refused to rebuild, and refused to forget. Number 2, the École Primaire Villefontaine, near Lyon, France. This one is deeply disturbing, please be prepared. In 2015, a 45-year-old headteacher at a primary school in Villefontaine near Lyon was arrested. The charges: the rape of 9 children at his own school, the deliberate abuse of young pupils in his care committed over an extended period of time. The investigation that followed revealed something that horrified France even more than the crimes themselves. This man had a prior conviction from 2008 for possessing images of child sexual abuse. Despite that conviction, he had never been banned from working with children. He had been cleared, processed, and allowed back into a position of complete authority over young students in a French primary school. The school was closed immediately. The community was devastated. Parents who had trusted this institution, who had kissed their children goodbye at those gates every single morning, were left with questions that had no good answers. How had this happened? Who had checked? Who had signed off? Who had looked at his file and said, yes, this person can go back to a classroom? The case triggered a national reckoning about vetting procedures for school employees across France, about how someone with a documented history of this kind had been allowed to hold the keys to a primary school full of children. French child protection laws were subsequently reviewed and tightened in the wake of this case. But for the families of those 9 children, the reform came far, far too late. And finally, number 1. The school that sits frozen in time in the middle of a ruined village. The school whose children made headlines around the world not for what they learned, but for what happened to them on the last day they were ever there. Number 1. The school at Oradour-sur-Glane, the boys' primary school, Haute-Vienne, France. We return to Oradour-sur-Glane, but this time we talk specifically about the school. Because the village had 2 schools, a boys' school, a girls' school, and on June 10, 1944, children from both of them were sitting in their classrooms when the soldiers arrived. The boys were marched out with the men. The girls, along with their female teacher, were taken to the church with the women of the village. A photograph exists. It was taken sometime between 1940 and 1944. It shows a class of boys at Oradour School lined up in rows in the sunshine, squinting into the camera the way children do in school photographs the world over. The caption beneath that photograph reads, "All of the people pictured here were killed by the SS during the June 10, 1944 massacre." Another photograph shows a class of girls, same school, same sunshine, same caption. The SS did not spare the children. The school building itself, like everything else in Oradour-sur-Glane, has never been demolished, never repaired, never reopened. By order of the French state, the ruins stand exactly as they were left on the evening of June 10, 1944. You can visit today. You can walk past the shell of that school building. You can see where the desks once stood, where the chalkboard once hung, where a teacher once called the register on what began as a completely ordinary Tuesday morning. And you can look at the names carved into the memorial nearby and understand that the reason this school was abandoned is not negligence. It is not contamination. It is not an explosion or a cover-up or an institution that failed its children. It is grief, pure and permanent grief. It is a country saying, we will not pretend this did not happen. We will not smooth it over. We will not rebuild and move on as if those children's desks were never full. The most disturbing thing about the school at Oradour-sur-Glane is not its ruin. It is the silence that fills it. 12 schools, 12 stories that France and the world would rather forget. From the haunting, frozen classrooms of a mountain school nobody claimed, to the toxic lead cloud that settled over Paris schoolyards while officials stayed quiet. From the asbestos hidden inside walls for decades, to the explosion that shattered a city in a single Friday morning. From the elite boarding school in the Pyrenees where hundreds of children suffered across generations while the powerful looked the other way, to the village school in Oradour, where the last lesson was interrupted and never finished. What connects all of these stories isn't just abandonment. It's the patterns behind it: silence, negligence, cover-ups, institutional failure, and in some cases, deliberate cruelty. These schools were not abandoned because no one cared. They were abandoned because something happened inside them or around them that was simply too heavy to carry forward. And the buildings that remain are not just crumbling concrete and rusted iron. They are memories, warnings, and in some cases, indictments. So tell me, which of these 12 schools disturbed you the most? Was it the cover-up in Paris, the decades of silence in the Pyrenees, or the stillness of Oradour-sur-Glane? Drop your answer in the comments right now. I read every single one. And if this video made you think, made you feel, or made you see France differently, give it a like. It genuinely helps this channel grow and allows us to keep telling the stories that don't make it into the textbooks. Subscribe and hit the notification bell because there is a lot more coming that you absolutely cannot afford to miss. I'll see you in the next one.